I'm recording too. Oh, I love the idea of doing like some dandelion tea with honey and lemonade. That sounds very good. Especially today it was very hot in Colorado, so or very hot. It's 70 degrees, which is hot seasonally for me. I'm still in my winter skin. Um, Eric, the dandelions make or the weeds make you mad-ish.
Yeah, I mean, like you can only get so angry at a weed. Um, yeah, but I'm going back to the original definition, which is just a plant coming up where you didn't want it to be. And so,
Yeah.
Catherine's exhibit makes them all seem so pleasant. But if you were trying to grow vegetables and you had weeds coming in there, they're not all.
Yeah, but you've never tried eating them.
See, there you go, Natasha. Some yeah, headache.
Yeah,
Yeah, maybe
yeah.
I'm a little bit biased because I'm not a big gardener. Um,
uh,
but
So you were able
you
to
just
approach
like
it
crawling around
differently.
on all
Yeah.
fours and sort of munching and stuff that's on the ground.
I was reading this article from oh my God, it's like the Farmer's Almanac that was like what weeds can teach you about your garden and the nutrients and like soil needs, which was really interesting. Because I've just gotten into gardening and my fun research brain like goes crazy when I'm off of work. And it was talking about like how if you don't want dandelions to grow in a particular place, you should plant, like you should uproot them, plant something else that has like a deep tap root that will help
mm,
break up the soil. And it also like indicates some sort of nutrient deficiency, but I can't remember what. And so they were like, so carrots are a perfect thing to put in that space. And I was like, wait, weeds tell me things about my garden? Like that makes so much sense, and I had no idea. And then you can also like use them as kind of natural fertilizer too. So I thought that was pretty cool. Um, but yeah, very cool. All right, let's get started and we can just have other people join us as we go. Um, oh yeah,
Tallweed
torpedo
and
grass.
torpedo grass.
What
Natasha,
is
where are
torpedo
you?
grass?
I live in Southwest Florida, so gardening zone 10B. So I'm very far south.
Okay, so you have some really vicious weeds in.
Yeah, all year round, pretty much. And similar to what Rachel was saying, the dollar weed actually indicates like there's too much water. So that's actually how I
Mm,
realized that there was like an issue with one of our irrigation areas because there was a ton of dollar weed that was growing. And I
Ah,
was like, where is this coming from? And then I learned that dollar weed like grows where there's like an abundance of moisture. And we have mostly sandy soil here. So then I realized that one of the like pipes into the house was leaking. And so yeah, even though it's a pain in the butt to get rid of in garden beds, it did help me
mhm.
identify a problem with the leaky pipe.
Oh, I love that. That's so
it's a great
fascinating.
story.
Weeds, yeah,
yeah.
weeds have so much to teach us. And I feel like that's like a great lead in.
That
So,
is a great lead-in,
Eric, will you take it away?
great lead-in. And so I guess I'm not any place in the program so that you know who I am. I am a well, recently retired professor of environmental science and sustainability at Allegheny College and um, haven't fully walked away. I last year I had a conversation with Catherine, and I can't recall, and maybe Catherine can, how we came to this. Oh, I do remember. Catherine was looking for a topic for her senior thesis or year-long senior thesis, and I was like just fresh on the board with the Museum of Food and Culture. I'm also on the board of directors for the Museum of Food and Culture, and I was like, "Ooh, I've got an idea for you. How would you be interested in preparing an exhibit, a virtual exhibit for the museum?" And Catherine said, okay, Sure, let's do it. And Catherine spent from January to May of last year preparing an exhibit. And the thing I need to tell all of you about publishing is that I don't know how many of you who are watching have ever tried to publish anything, but to publish something um, is different from writing even a senior thesis, which is you have to make draft after draft after draft. You have to put your ego aside, but not your spine, because you have to give your work to somebody who says, you know, you should change this and you should change this. And when we say make those changes, every once in a while, you have to say, no, I don't think that's a good idea. I actually want to stand by this. And Katherine not only did all of that, but has stayed with it for another year. So she came back from last summer and has worked on this project since last September till 20 minutes ago, and uh, and has produced, I think, one of the most interesting publications I have seen in a long time. When you go through this site, you will be astonished at how much there is to learn about weeds and about eating them and about their histories and how the history reflects uh, reflects us, reflects back on us. And so I don't want to take up any more time. I do want to turn it over to Katherine, who is the second star of the show. The real star of the show is the exhibit, and I cannot encourage you enough to spend some time with this. This is in my opinion, and I read a lot and write a lot, this is a major work. So with that, I will turn it over to Katherine, who she and I met every week for all of last spring and every week since September to go over this and shape it. And I just got to give my opinion, and Katherine did all the work, and here's what she's done.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. Oh my gosh. You have been such an amazing advisor, and helped me a lot throughout this journey of creating this exhibit. Well, thank you so much. Couldn't have done it without you, honestly.
And you know,
But
I couldn't
yeah.
have done it without you, so it's mutual.
Oh. All right. Well, yeah, I'd love to show you guys a walkthrough. So I'm going to share my screen. And I figured instead of literally just scrolling through the actual website and give everyone motion sickness, I would just create like a presentation version so we can kind of go through it together, and just kind of talk about some of the biggest takeaways from the presentation. Yeah, thank you so much for attending the launch of my virtual exhibit, Eating Invasive Weeds. So a little bit about me. My name is Katherine, as you've heard. I am a senior at Allegheny College studying environmental science and sustainability. I'm originally from Collegeville, Pennsylvania, and I only began to really learn about foraging about like 4 or 5 years ago during the pandemic. I think, a lot of people were at home and had a lot of free time on their hands, and I mean, I have to give a lot of credit to Alexis Nicole Nelson, who, if you don't already know, is a really popular forager cook influencer on apps like TikTok and social media. And she creates these really amazing videos talking about all things foraging. And she was a really big inspiration and sort of opened up this whole world of foraging that like I didn't know about. So yeah, let's get into it. So the 5 weeds I am covering in the exhibit are dandelions, garlic mustard, broadleaf plantain, Japanese knotweed, and ground ivy. Now, I'm sure that you can probably recognize at least one of these plants as they're pretty popular. Maybe some, not as much, but I guarantee by the time you've gone through the exhibit, you will realize that these plants are growing literally everywhere and you won't be able to unsee them. Yeah, not only are they common, but it doesn't matter, even if you live in like an urban or suburban area, you'll be able to find these plants nearby. I think there's sometimes a misconception that foraging can only be done in like a forest or in a really rural setting, but really foraging can be done anywhere. You can find these plants pretty much anywhere where there's soil, whether that's a sidewalk crack or along a road somewhere. These plants are like pretty prevalent and resilient to a lot of conditions. Um, Another thing to point out is that they all grow in early spring. So around this time right now, actually, you'll probably see a lot of these growing, or even a week from now, if you decide to go on a walk, I'm sure that you will see a lot of these around. So yeah, this is the perfect time really to be taking advantage of the exhibit. Also, these plants are all non-native, so they're not originally from North America. They've been introduced from either Asia or Europe. They're also all considered weeds, and a big part of the exhibit is I wanted to really challenge what it means to be a weed, because we tend to like throw a lot of plants into that category, but these plants exist on such a wide spectrum that if you really start to like look at it and unpack it, you'll see that it's a lot more complicated than that. But I won't get too much into it because you'll discover that for yourself as you go through the exhibit. And then finally, probably the most important thing about these plants is that they have no toxic lookalikes, right? Like I wanted to make this as like beginner friendly as possible. It can be intimidating for a lot of people to get into like foraging because they might be worried about eating something they're not supposed to, but I made sure that these plants are pretty easy to identify and you don't have to worry about accidentally eating it's like extremely poisonous look-alike, because some plants are like that, but I wanted to stay away from that. All right, so this is the homepage for the exhibit. You'll see on the right side, shout out to my roommate who her and I were picking dandelions around this time last spring, and we actually made one of the recipes that you'll see on here. So yeah, this is on our campus. But if you take a look at the top bar menu, you'll see that there is an exhibit section. And after going through all this, if later on you're like, oh, I just found out there's a bunch of like ground ivy in my backyard and I want to go back and review that section, if you hover over the exhibit, there'll be a little drop down menu and you're welcome to just skip right to that plant. But for the first time, I highly recommend starting at the beginning of the tour by clicking go. And that'll be kind of like your typical museum exhibit walkthrough where they'll go through each plant and learn about it. So clicking on go will take you to the introduction of the exhibit. This section just sort of gives a little bit of background information, like what to expect with the exhibit, a few basic guidelines for foraging, just, you know, some context before really getting into the weeds, pun intended. But yeah, then once you've gone through that, you'll begin with the first plant, which is the dandelion. And so something to note is that I go through each of the 5 plants individually, so all the information will be in one section with the recipes at the very end. All right, so one of the first things that you'll see for each of the plants is a little bit of like an identification key. I'm sure most of us know what a dandelion looks like, but again, I wanted this to be super like beginner friendly. Anybody, no matter what their background, expertise in plants, if they were to, you know, check out this exhibit, they wouldn't have any issues being able to identify the plant. So I found it the most like easy to process by breaking it down by parts of the plant. So usually you'll see like I break it down by the leaves, the flowers, maybe if there's like a really specific leaf arrangement. And also some of the plants look very different at different stages of their life cycle. So I also make sure to point that out. So there's like absolutely no confusion about what you should be looking for. All right. One of the main things that is covered for each of the plants is the historical uses in both the native and introduced ranges, and also how it was introduced to North America. Like I said, all these plants are non-native here. They've been introduced from either Asia or Europe, and they each have a really unique and fascinating story about how they ended up here. Um, some of them were introduced intentionally, whether it was like a really important medicinal plant from certain countries that settlers used, or it was used in like as decoration in gardens. But others you'll find were actually introduced unintentionally, like maybe their seeds were unintentionally dispersed because they were stuck to settlers' clothing or whatnot. Yeah, they each have a really unique kind of origin story. And especially if you look at the uses from like 100 or 200 years ago compared to now, it's really like a contrast to how we view a lot of these plants today, because people had a lot of really important uses for them, but now not so much. So I think that's a really important piece to understand when you go about foraging. And then a really important part of that history is the role that Black and Indigenous communities played in it. So a lot of what we know today about these plants and foraging in general is thanks to the Black and Indigenous communities in North America. Yeah, like once you really start going down the rabbit hole of foraging, you'll discover that there is just a lot that, you know, might not be like mainstream knowledge. And I think today there are a lot of like modern resources that start to talk about these histories that have, you know, it's like usually have been intentionally under acknowledged. Like for example, Alexis Nicole Nelson has a lot of really like interesting and useful videos talking about how colonialism has sort of had a huge influence on foraging today in the United States or North America in general. So yeah, yeah, colonization has played a really huge role in how we view a lot of these plants today. Like a lot of the reasons why we view certain plants a certain way, whether that be good or bad, is because of that. Often a very like complex roots, but it's important that when you go about foraging that you understand and acknowledge this past, both the major contributions of Black and Indigenous communities, as well as how colonization has sort of warped our perception of foraging in certain plants. All right, and then another really important thing I cover for each plant is the environmental impact of each. So all of these plants are technically considered weeds, but I wanted to make sure that foragers know exactly what they do for the ecosystem outside of that sort of like concept. So some of these plants are supposedly bad. Like in their introduced range, they crowd out native biodiversity. Some of them even like secrete like a toxic chemical into the soil to kill other native plants in order to spread even more. But at the same time, other plants within that category are actually beneficial for their introduced range. So some plants actually break up damaged, compressed soil and help to make it more healthy. And so other plants can also live there together with them. So it's really interesting to unpack like what these plants are actually doing underneath the soil. And this will really like change your perception for a lot of these plants. And you'll kind of be able to decide for yourself if you think these plants are good or bad, or like, should we still be calling these plants weeds? Should that like exist? So yeah. And now that you've read all that information for the plants, then you'll be able to move on to the harvesting part. So I know as a beginner forager, I sometimes ran into this issue where I would have my basket and my trowel, I'd be outside, I'd be getting ready to look for a plant to harvest, and then I'd realize, well, hold on, maybe I don't actually know exactly what I should be foraging. Like, do I pull up the whole plant? Is that wasteful? Am I going to use that? Do I just need a part of it? Those sorts of questions. And that can kind of ruin the whole experience. So, the purpose of this section is to really help you prepare for that. So, I kind of break down each plant by which parts that you want to harvest and when. Like an important thing that'll really influence how your, harvested cooking turns out is when you harvest it, which isn't always like clear, right? So this is kind of breaking that part down to make it super straightforward and easy. You know exactly what you're doing, what you're looking for, and what you need. And then after you've harvested that, I sort of break down what each part of the plant tastes like. And this is just kind of like a general guideline of like flavors, what it tastes really good as if you decide to keep it raw or if you decide to cook it. And you can kind of click through each part of the plant and it'll give you a little bit of information. Yeah, and then finally, I have usually like 4 or 5 recipes for each of the plants that you can do. So this is like a combination of all different plants, but you'll be surprised what some of these plants can be made into. Like, it doesn't just have to be you eating leafy greens. Some of them are like really creative. For example, you can turn knotweed into a sorbet. So if you have a sugar tooth like me, this is like really enjoyable. And then also Alexis Nicole Nelson has a really amazing video where she uses the seeds of broadleaf plantain to make an egg substitute for like baked goods, which in a million years, I never would have thought you could do that. And if you're like vegan or you want to save money buying eggs, then this could be a really cool alternative. So like there's a whole lot of different cool recipes that you can use with your foraged goods. Yeah, and then once you've gone through each of the plants, I have a learn more section, which is basically a collection of different apps, books, podcasts, etc., that you can explore. The way I see the exhibit is sort of like, well, it's a lot of information, but it's also sort of like the tip of the iceberg. So I really encourage people that if there's a particular bit of information that really intrigues them, that they go out and they keep trying to learn more about it. So this is kind of an opportunity for that. Like some of these are more specifically foraging related. Like for example, Picture This is an app that I actually use a lot. You take a picture of a plant and it tries to tell you what it is. That can be really useful. But also if you decide, whoa, I really liked that section talking about how like communities use foraging as a way to become like acquire food sovereignty, then maybe you can like there's a book there that'll tell like you can read more about it, all that kind of good stuff. So I highly encourage people who view the exhibit to just seek out more information, because I probably could have worked on this exhibit for like 5 more years and there would still be more things I would want to talk about. There is just such like an expanse of knowledge about like the foraging world. So it's kind of hard to like, sum that up in a single exhibit, but I hope this is like a good way to get people interested in researching on their own. And then, yeah, so that's basically a quick walkthrough of the website. Obviously, the exhibit's a lot more specific, it has more information, but I hope that was like a nice little taste of what you'll find. So, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katherine. Like this is so amazing. I like I don't know. This is one of those exhibits that just kind of came across my desk via Eric. Thank you, Eric. And it wasn't a topic that I'd ever explored or thought about really before. And oh, for those of you who don't know me, I'm the founder and executive director of the Museum of Food and Culture, and my background is very much in like kind of the food studies side of the world, really thinking about food as a way to connect with people and as a way to gather communities together. And that's a lot of what we do with the museum programming. And foraging always seemed like it was kind of on this outskirts of culture and like something that, you know, is not really done in the mainstream. And it was so awesome to be able to see this exhibit because then I was like, wait a second, why am I not like eating the dandelions that are speckling my yard right now? Like, what can we make with them? And even starting to like walk around the neighborhood and be like, oh, is that garlic mustard in its first year of growth? Like, has just been such a cool experience because I've never been somebody who like feels like I know what I'm looking at when I look at plants. And so I think this is so perfect for kind of the introductory forager, the person who's like just interested in seeing a little bit more of the world around them. Um, we're gonna hop into the Q&A in a minute, so grab your questions. But I just also wanted to give a shout out to the Museum of Food and Culture as a nonprofit organization. Like this work and is done by and supported by cool audience members like you guys. So if you love this exhibit and want to see more, please consider donating to us or volunteering for us. We would love it. We need all the help we can get. And we just love people who are super excited and enthusiastic about food. All right, now I want to hop into the Q&A with Katherine because I personally have so many questions about like just the things that I learned in this exhibit. And I know that other people haven't had a chance to like go through it yet. Um, but I would love to kick us off. And then as we go, if you guys want to just come off mute or drop questions in the chat, we can get those answered and asked as well. So bring any and all questions about edible weeds. Um, so Katherine, I am curious, would you talk a little bit more about your story and like how you got interested in particular in foraging and invasive plants and like how that intersects with your degrees and yeah, like what brought you to this out of kind of all of the different ways that you could go with environmental science?
Yeah, so I really only began foraging about like 5 years ago. Um, I knew that I was interested in environmental science around this time,
Mhm.
but my like exposure to foraging was very minimal. I am from like a very suburban area where my relationship to a lot of like outdoor like wild plants was limited to either my front and backyard or the park, and that's a very like artificial maintained version of like what plants are, I guess. Like lawn culture plays a really huge part in like suburban life. So the only way I viewed plants was very either like, okay, this is a plant in my yard that needs to be removed, or the complete opposite, which is like, oh, a national forest or a national park has all this like lush, untouched vegetation. But then I kind of stumbled across the account Black Forager on TikTok, and also she's on Instagram. Her name's Alexis Nicole Nelson, and she's a really cool resource. And I think if you have anything to do with foraging, you know her name. Um, she's really amazing, but she kind of talks about a lot of different plants that were also like common where I live, and that kind of like opened up this whole world of foraging. It like changed my entire perception of plants. Like foraging didn't have to be somebody frolicking around in like a giant forest. I could be foraging in my own neighborhood. Um, and then once you kind of start, you can't stop. Like there's two different paths you go down. You're either like, oh, this isn't for me, or you're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And then you start to learn more and more. And then you end up making something like the virtual exhibit with like all this information because you just want to put it out there and share it. But yeah, it's like it's a whole like crazy world that was opened up to me that I like didn't really know about before. And I think probably a lot of people have a similar experience with their like relationship with plants.
Yeah. I feel like that is exactly, I don't know, like that's exactly what I got when I was going through the exhibit too. I always thought of foraging as something that like I needed to take a class in or something that like, yeah, you go to like we're in Colorado, so you go to the mountains. I'm in Denver, so not in the mountains, and you like go to the mountains and it's like a specific forage day. I didn't really like I knew that dandelions specifically were edible because they're everywhere. But like not any other plants, and I never was like, can you can forage in urban settings? Like, what does that even look, or suburban settings? What does that look like? Um, and let's see. Oh, okay. We've got one question coming in from Trevor. Hi, Trevor. Trevor went to grad school with me, so yay. Do you have a favorite method of preserving edible plants?
Hi. Okay, usually I haven't really done a whole lot of like preserving, like dehydrating or anything like that. Usually I just try to like use it, like cook it right away. But I find like disinfecting it is really useful. Like regardless if you're foraging, you should be like cleaning your foraged goods. But I usually like will wash it with like water and vinegar, maybe a little salt, lemon juice, just to like kill any like bacteria, and that can help it like last for a couple of days, but usually I try to like use it all up right away. But I'm sure there's like lots of different ways you could experiment with like preserving and keeping foraged goods in your kitchen.
Yeah. Yeah, what about you, Trevor? Like I know Trevor runs a company called Community Cultures out in Pittsburgh, which is all about like fermentation and educational workshops and initiatives. Like, have you tried fermenting foraged foods? I don't know. Have you?
I have actually. That's why I was curious,
Mm,
Catherine, if you have experimented with like different types of preservation. I just fermented some garlic mustard with into like a cultured cheese with almonds. Um, and I've dabbled with like Japanese knotweed and other things, but um, I I love foraging and I love fermentation, but I haven't combined the two that much. So that's why I was
mhm. Oh, interesting. And cool, thank you for sharing, Trevor. Taylor asked you, Catherine, do you have any practical tips for finding good areas to forage? Are there certain types of environments that should be avoided, even if they have an abundance of plants, like the dog park? Thank you, because that I also was like, can I get the dandelions in my yard, or like have they been peed on by all of the city dogs? Like, what does this look like? And also hi to Taylor. Taylor went to college with me, so it's like fun reunion. Yay. Um, yeah, what do you think,
Yeah,
Catherine?
that's a really good question. Because yeah, there's a lot of factors that go into where you should be foraging. Because you don't I always say, and there's a lot of different like sources that say this, you want to try to avoid really busy areas, especially high traffic areas. Like you shouldn't be foraging along like a highway or a really busy road because any sort of like um runoff from anything coming out of cars or like salt, anything that you don't want to be consuming is probably going to be accumulating along those areas. So you want to try to avoid anything like that. Um, Also, you want to keep in mind you want to make sure you're not harvesting anything that could potentially be like treated or like sprayed. And usually you can tell because the plant won't look too healthy. So you want to make sure you're foraging things that, look like they haven't been treated with any harsh chemicals. Um, yeah, like as a rule of thumb, if it doesn't look healthy, you definitely don't want to be eating that. I also try to stay away from eating the roots of plants. I know like especially with dandelions, a lot of plants tend to like accumulate like heavy metals or things you don't want to be ingesting in their roots. So if you're worried, I would definitely stay away from that. It's also important to know where you're legally allowed to forage because you should know your local kind of like property laws or foraging laws, which can be difficult. A lot of areas don't necessarily have really fleshed out rules on like where you can forage, but you want to make sure you're not trespassing on private property, or if you're in a park, you want to make sure that there's no rules against harvesting any of the wildlife or plants there. So just like a couple
Where,
things to always account for.
yeah. And like, where can you find those rules? Like, is it going to be on like your city government's website, or do you just have to do some sleuthing on the internet so that you can, before you start like picking things as you go? Because I'm definitely like, I know there are dandelions and other weeds in my local park, and also I don't know if I can grab them. So how do you figure that part out?
Yeah, I mean you're definitely gonna have to do a little bit of sleuthing. It's not
Mhm.
always super obvious. But yeah, like I always like try to do like an online search, see if anything comes up. But I don't know, like usually if they're very much against you foraging, it's actually like easier to find information about that because it's just like do not like whatever. But yeah, no, it really depends.
Yeah. Them. And Natasha says she always wanted to get into remedies using weeds like Biden's alma, or is it plantain, or it's plantain, but I've never tried it. Plantain. Um, yeah, like have you ever used any of these invasive weeds kind of like for the medicinal purposes? Because I know you obviously you have a lot of the like eating piece in there. And I think like one of the things that was most interesting to me about this exhibit is how much like all of these plants had both nutritional value but also like medicinal value, and could cure like anything from like headaches to using it like using the weed as a diuretic. Have you ever tried any of them, or I don't know, any like anecdotal use of
Right.
it?
Well, like you said, like historically, a lot of different communities have used the plants in like a medicinal way. But me personally, I haven't used them usually in like at least for anything like major. But I have used broadleaf plantain for just like insect bites. That's something that you
Mm,
can do with it, which again is like a very like non-intrusive, very like chill remedy, I guess. But I wouldn't necessarily rely on these plants for any sort of like medical attention. But
yeah,
I do think it is interesting to like learn about what people have used it for in the past.
yeah, awesome. I'm curious, like I think there was so much for me to learn with this exhibit. I'm curious, like, what you learned with this exhibit. What surprised you the most, like, as you were doing the research for, or even just in like the act of kind of trying to compile it as an exhibit? I know that you originally were working with Eric on this as I believe like a semester long project, and then it did kind of expand, which is so cool, just like a weed, like it just started taking over.
Yeah.
And I'm like so like it's such value on the other side. So, yeah, what surprised you?
I guess like how much information there is. Like that sounds kind of silly. Like of course there's like a lot of information, but I guess like on the surface, my initial idea of foraging was very different than what it actually ended up being because like I mentioned before, I think there's oftentimes this idea that foraging is something that like like a mystical like princess is like out in a forest like foraging for mushrooms or something, but no, like you can forage anywhere as long as there's like plants around. And also just like the almost how like political foraging is. Like there's so much of an interesting history to it, and just seeing how like laws and policies have directly influenced foraging, and like access to foraging in the United States. And of course there's a lot more detail about this on the exhibit, but it's just like this huge like ocean of information and history, and like the more you learn about it, the more you're like, whoa, this is so deep. I thought this was just about like cute mushrooms. Like no, it's like there's so much more to it than that, and like it plays such a huge role in so many communities, and it's just like this really amazing and like oftentimes powerful tool that's provided like autonomy for people or like food sovereignty. It's just like it's so much more than what I thought it was.
Yeah, that's amazing. Um, and definitely comes across in the exhibit. I'm curious, like, and I know that there's also a question in the chat, but could you talk a little
Mhm.
bit too about like why you think um, foraging and eating invasive plants is important, and then also maybe a little bit kind of like why foraging is kind of seen as that mystical, like frolicking in the forest, gathering mushrooms sort of thing, compared to what the actual history is. Um, so those are like two different questions, but I'm curious, like why you think it's important and why you think that foraging kind of had this remake and like what the historical context is of that.
Yeah, so I think it's foraging has almost become like a forgotten art in a way. Like it used to be very like common for most people like around the world and in the United States to like forage either like for food or for like building material, just like it, you know, like before there was like Walmart, right? Like before you could go out and just like buy things, it was super common for people to just go out and collect those materials on their own, whether out of necessity or out of like cultural practice. But it's because of a lot of like shifts in social perceptions and laws and policies, it's been done less and less, at least like in the mainstream. And it's sort of like a lot of people don't know how to do it anymore. So I think kind of bringing that back is really important, to just like bring back an old tradition. But also foraging can be a really powerful tool, like if you don't want to like if you want to have an alternative source of food outside of like going to the supermarket, especially if you don't have easy access to that. Like I know Meadville is what they call like a food swamp, so there's only like a few supermarkets and they're not like easily accessible to everyone in the community. So you know, if that's like a situation, foraging can be a really important tool for gaining the right nutrients to survive. And it, yeah, so it, I think, yeah, that answers the question.
Yeah, there were a lot of questions in there. Yes. Yeah, I think that it is such a extensive history and it is in some ways like very weird how like how much we don't forage now. Um
Yeah. And
and
it's hard to like
yeah.
explain that in a single
Yeah.
answer, but
Yes, yeah. But definitely like something that kind of was food for thought for me after like going through the exhibit. So Skip, my father, hi Dad. And Natasha wanted to know, why is the dandelion so hated? It's such a pretty plant.
oh my gosh, this is such a good question. I I agree. I think the dandelion is so beautiful, and it at one point was a really important and valued plant in the US, but lawn culture, especially like suburban areas of the US really played a big role in how we view specifically the dandelion. You know, like it became socially acceptable and even like required to sort of have this pristine grass monoculture lawn. And dandelions are just one of those plants that happens to thrive really well in that environment. And of course, like we can't have that. We can't have dandelions growing in our lawn. So, like I know sometimes I tease my dad because he loves our grass lawn and it's like another child to him. And I'm always like, why can't we just let some of these like wild plants grow? Why do we need it to be so uniform and green? But it's just like years and years of this sort of like culture that's like come out of suburban areas and these like turf grass lawns. So yeah, dandelions have kind of become like public enemy number one.
They really have. And like I remember too, as like kids, you wish on a dandelion, like that part,
Yeah.
like it's associated with a lot of fun. And there was always that thing too of what is it? If you like rub it on your skin, it can turn yellow or something. Like I don't
Hmm.
remember why. But there were like kid superstitions around that. And it just is so surprising that yeah, then you like grow up to be an adult and the world is like, okay, no, hate these now.
Yeah.
um there's a question that Flo and I were actually chatting about over email that I'm curious about. That is what makes something like considered an invasive plant? At what point, like, is there a threshold for how like or yeah, I guess like how prevalent and aggressive it is to be considered invasive? Because truthfully, like some of the tomatoes in my yard have been on that invasive side, like just starting to spread everywhere over the summer. So like what makes something invasive and a weed?
Yeah, so I'll start with invasive. So invasive is
Mhm.
basically a plant that is non-native. So it's been introduced to a new area, and in this new environment, its, you know, natural checks and balances are absent. So it's able to spread very aggressively and cause a lot of like ecological damage by like smothering native biodiversity, other plants that you know, are native and like should hypothetically be there, but this plant has sort of like taken over. Like for example, garlic mustard, I would say is definitely invasive because its roots secrete a toxin that prevents other plants from growing. So you'll end up with like an entire forest floor covered in garlic mustard. That would be considered invasive. I'm sure there's like a exact like quantitative way to measure that and define that, but that's usually how I look at it.
Okay.
But then at the same time, like native plants can be aggressive, but they're not necessarily invasive. Like I think it's like hay-scented fern is technically native
Mm.
to Pennsylvania forests, but it can still spread uncontrollably if like the conditions are right. So it's really interesting, but um yeah, it's just invasives are so special because for the most part, usually it's because of human activity that they are showing the invasive behavior, which, you know, is pretty common nowadays.
Yeah. And then the weed is more of like a cultural label,
Yeah,
essentially.
weed doesn't necessarily have a definitive definition. Like it really depends what source you look at or who you ask. Like I think I was looking at like the USDA or like the some sort of like source, but like how over the years, even they have like changed their definition of what a weed is repeatedly because sometimes it's just, oh, a weed is something that causes ecological damage, but maybe it also causes damage, which is defined as like damage, like it interferes with like a crop and like being able to produce as much as that crop as possible, or maybe like some definitions are just like it's an eyesore, I don't like it, it's a weed. So like it's a really broad word that I try to not use because it really is like subjective. So I prefer to use more like scientific terms like invasive or native or naturalized, which even then can have a
Yeah.
little bit of like wiggle room, but I don't like the
Mm-hmm.
word weed. It's like a bad word.
Yes. And Flo also shared like a USDA resource from the Forest Service on what is an invasive plant species.
Oh,
And
nice.
exactly what you said, it was, yeah, it's the two kind of components are non-native and introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. But it is, yeah, it is very interesting because you do have your native plants that are like super intense on their own. And it's like, well, why, why are we valuing certain plants in certain ways?
Yeah.
Flo, did you want to share anything too? Oh, you
Well,
came off mute.
invasive species actually do real harm.
Hmm.
And there's a whole list that Forest Service has that are, have invaded Colorado. Dalmatian toadflax. It's a very, very pretty plant. It actually,
Hmm.
you might think it's a snapdragon because that's the flower seed pod looks very much like snapdragons, but it can be, you know, toxic to the environment. And another one that's more like a tree or a bush is salt cedar, also known as tamarisk, and that was introduced as an ornamental um, because it's beautiful. It's got these really feathery, flowy flowers that are quite large, and they're pink or purple, light pink, and they're gorgeous, but they're phreatophytes, and they can dewater a river and a stream like nobody's business. And the other thing they do is they concentrate salt in their leaves, and when they drop the leaves, it creates a salty environment, so other plants can't cope with it, And then Russian olives, we all know about Russian olives. They smell wonderful. They're delightful plants. They have a beautiful scent when they're blooming, but they get
Hmm.
thistles and they grow very close together, and they like to be in drainages, and it prevents wildlife from getting down to the river to drink and all kinds of stuff. So, invasive plants, invasive species are really serious, whether they're bugs or they're plants. And I think at the top of the hour, I typed in, a weed is a plant that's growing where you don't want it to grow.
Hmm.
Invasive species take weeds to the next level. They actually harm the environment. They harm other plants. They make it inhospitable for native species to thrive. It's kind of like introducing, you know, rainbow trout, which ate the native cutthroat trout, right? So,
Hmm. Ah, that's a good distinction. And like, yeah, that makes sense that it's just a step above. Um, and Natasha shared in the chat too, like in Florida, there's a highly invasive Brazilian pepper that's wreaking havoc in the natural habitats and with natives as well. So, um, yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Thank you all. All right, I want to be mindful of time and get one more question in to wrap this up. So, Catherine, I am actually going to combine two questions in one, as I think is my favorite thing to do, apparently. Um, so part one is what do you hope this exhibit might change for the way that people relate to their own yards or green spaces? And then part two is what advice would you give to aspiring or new foragers? Yeah, like two pieces.
Oh my gosh, I think I could write like a 20-page essay to answer that question, but I think the short answer is I just want somebody to, or whoever decides to view the exhibit, to at least have one thing that really speaks to them that changes their perspective on plants or just foraging. and decides to like continue to look into that and kind of change the way they go about like perceiving their environment, whether that be how they take care of their lawn or how they go about foraging, just like recognizing like herbalism history in America. I just want people to sort of like reevaluate their relationship with plants.
I love that.
I think that was
And
the
I
first
think
part of
we,
your question. There was a second
yeah.
part.
I mean, I think the exhibit definitely, at least for me, I'm like, this definitely changed the way that I'm relating to my own yard and the way that I'm like moving around in the world and just walking in the neighborhood, trying to be like, is that garlic mustard? Is that broadleaf plantain? The second part was like, what advice would you give to aspiring or new foragers?
Ooh. Okay, this is gonna be corny. I'm gonna quote Shia LaBeouf, but just do it. Like you just have to like it can be very intimidating to start. I think there's a lot of like worries about like how people are good who are watching them forage are gonna feel about that, or like, oh, like no, I need like it to be the right aesthetic to go. It's like, no, just go start. And even if it's like a lot of trial and error, or you're not like, you don't feel like you're prepared, you just have to start somewhere and then it'll just get better and you'll like realize how much fun it is and you'll just start gaining more and more skills and experience. And then you'll be like, oh, I got this, I'm a pro. But it can be intimidating, but you just have to like start and then it's easy from there and a whole
Oh,
lot
I
of
love
fun.
that. Yeah. I love that. And that is, it's kind of like you speaking to past you during the pandemic of like, just go
Yeah.
out, just start. And lo and behold, like you ended up creating the whole exhibit based off of that experience and newfound interest. And I think definitely inspires all of us to like go look at plants in a different way and start examining the weeds that are, taking over our lawns or native areas and just trying to figure out other uses for them. So I want to thank you, Catherine, because this exhibit has been incredible to learn from and experience. And I hope that you guys all poke around the website. It is awesome. Catherine set it up so that it's like a guided tour through each of the plants. So I highly recommend that you look at that. The link is in the chat, and we'll be sending out more stuff in our newsletter as well. But for now, Catherine, I just wanted to say thank you so much. This is incredible. Like, I'm so excited that it's live, and yay, congratulations.
Hey, thank you so much, Rachel.
It's awesome. Thank you, everybody. Great. Awesome. Cool. All right. I'm gonna stop recording. Ding.